and thank you, Manjari, for inviting me here to host this session with Vikram Sampath on his latest book, Savarkar, Echoes from a Forgotten Past. I won't waste much time and go straight headlong into the discussion. Vikram, this book has been a labor of love for you. You've worked hard for almost, I think, 2 years on this book.
4 years.
Wow. And in the prologue of this book, you end with a very poignant note saying that I wish that national icons, be it Savarkar, be it Nehru, be it anybody, should not be a political football in the vicious political game that we have these days. But that's exactly what has been happening with Savarkar, right? That is exactly what Manishankar Iyer tried to do. And I think you said that that's how you got into this idea about writing this book in the first place. So could you talk about it a little bit?
Sure. A very good evening, everyone. It's always wonderful to be back at the Pune International Literature Festival, so ably curated and conducted by Manjari Prabhu, my dear friend, and her entire team of very enthusiastic volunteers. Thank you, Manjari. To your question, Shefali, as a student who studied in Central Syllabus, CBSE, and I'm sure there may be many of you here as well, who Savarkar was never a topic in our history textbooks. I don't even remember any reference to him in our history textbooks in high school. Nor was there any reference to the cellular jail where he languished for more than 12 years and faced some of the most inhuman tortures. And along with him, I think an entire generation of freedom fighters, revolutionaries, political prisoners, their stories were almost whitewashed and wiped away. And so, in spite of being a history buff myself, Savarkar never, I knew someone like this existed, but I didn't know much about him. But then my first brush with him came about in 2003, initially when the previous Vajpayee government put up his portrait in the Central Hall of Parliament, and that raised a lot of heckles in itself. There was a lot of protests, and around the same time you also had a plaque, a memorial plaque in his name at the cellular jail, Kalapani cellular jail in Port Blair. And 1 year later, once you had a change in government and the UPA came to power, you had the then minister, petroleum minister, Mr. Manishankar Iyer, who got that plaque removed, and a lot of disparaging comments were made about this man. Almost everywhere, I think I seem to be giving a lot of credit and publicity to Manishankar Iyer in the course of this book. But then, sometimes negative publicity also helps, because it was his highly vitriolic statements and very personalized kind of comments that he's prone to make, which actually piqued my interest in this man. And in my entire course of writing, whenever a character is either maligned, misunderstood, or forgotten, that's when my interest in them is aroused. My first book on the history of Mysore, the Wadeyars, again a family that is hardly known. Gohar Jan, completely forgotten. Veena Vidwan S. Balachandar, who was very, very maligned by the Carnatic music fraternity. So Savarkar neatly fit into this series of either maligned, misunderstood, or forgotten heroes of our past. And though, if you actually look at it, ever since, I think, 2014 and the new government coming to power, there's probably not a single day, and whether or not we are interested in him or in history or whatever, there's probably not a single day when there is some reference of him in the newspapers and the raucous television debates that we have on TV, where Rahul Gandhi will mock him, then Savarkar's grandson will file a defamation case against him, the Rajasthan government will spend valuable time debating whether there should be a Veer prefixed to his name or not, as if that's such an important state subject. The Chhattisgarh chief minister will say he is the person who caused the two-nation theory. More recently, you had his bust, being blackened by the NSUI students wing of the Congress party, and the backfall of all of that. And just 2 days back, at my book launch in Mumbai, Mr. Uddhav Thackeray, made statements around how he deserves a Bharat Ratna, and if he were the prime minister, then probably there would be no Pakistan and all of that. And that led to another spiral of news and controversy. So he intrudes our modern political discourse like probably no other leader does. But yet, as an objective historian, as a young person who was interested in his life, when I looked back and saw what was it about this man that people know, either his proponents or his opponents, I was quite amazed to see that probably the last comprehensive biography of his was written way back in the 1960s or 70s
Dhananjay Keer,
Dhananjay Keer. And after that, there's been hardly anybody, and of course, Maharashtra and in Marathi, probably a lot of books have been written, but for a larger pan-Indian audience and in English, there's been next to nothing. And even the books that have been written are either extreme hagiographies, which extol him to no end, or the other extreme is this, highly vilified versions of him, denigrating him, demonizing him. So history always, in my view, there are no extremes of black and white. There are more than 50 shades of gray when it comes to history. And the truth lies in this continuum of, black and white. And that was what I thought. And as Toni Morrison had said sometime, if there's a book that you want to read and it's not been written yet, you must be the one to write it. So I hence took it upon myself, and with the senior fellowship at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, I decided to set off on this research journey over the last 3 to 4 years. It's been a fascinating journey, rummaging archives, the National Archives of India, the Pune Kesari Archives, the archives in Bombay, and archives outside India. 30,000 pages of documents from the British Library in London and the National Archives of UK, from France, from Germany, Marathi documents which have hitherto never been, used by historians and writers outside Maharashtra. And luckily I do understand the language, so it was a little better. And you have helped me so much with translating many of the books, in chaste Marathi, which goes over my head. So putting all of this together is what I've tried to present, a very objective, in my view, an objective assessment of the man, warts and all. And I think everyone needs to be presented that way, and it's up to the discerning readers to make up their mind. When the facts and the archival records scream and talk for themselves, I don't think a historian needs to sit too much in judgment of what the subject is all about.
Fair enough. But do you not think that the vilification and the systematic demonization of Savarkar is a thing of a more recent vintage, like post-2014? Because before that, Indira Gandhi, when he passed away, she spoke a very touching eulogy about Savarkar. She released a postal stamp with Savarkar. She asked Films Division professors to do an excellent documentary on Savarkar. And not only that, I've read that when Savarkar passed away and he actually stopped eating, he did cryopovation because he decided that I don't want to live anymore. And the first person to visit him was actually Kanhaiyalal Munshi, who was a very hardcore congressman. So it's not that the congressman or Congress has always been against Savarkar. So what happened post 2014? I mean, how did this change?
I think you're bang on the question in terms of, I don't think it's 2014, maybe it started much earlier, maybe towards the late 1990s, and certainly after 2003. My conjecture is around, say, the 1970s, when Hindutva, which Savarkar espoused, founded, gave it a sense of, comprehended it in some way, it was not a very potent political force in India. Whereas from the late 1990s, ever since the first NDA government under Mr. Vajpayee, and then of course from 2014 with 2 terms of Mr. Modi, Hindutva is there for everyone, staring you in your face, whether you like it or not. Across the country, more and more states are BJP ruled, or they're ruled by their allies. So in this context, to get at Hindutva and the BJP, the best victim that you find seems to be Savarkar, who was the father figure of this whole thing. Though there are, we could talk about it later, about how his Hindutva was totally different from what probably the RSS preached or what the BJP stands for and so on. But in politics, I don't think there's any place for any nuance. Everything has to be brushed under one paint. And somewhere, it's also this fact that, we heard that very disparaging comment of what the former leader of opposition, Mallikarjun Kharge, made in parliament, where he called upon the ruling party, the BJP, and said, even your dogs did not participate in the freedom struggle. So this whole narrative that, the freedom struggle has only one narrative, that it was only one stream of thought that ran the freedom struggle, the non-violent, stream, and it was the Congress which led it, and nobody else had any contribution to it. That is what has been ingrained into our minds over probably 2 generations through our history textbooks, and that's what probably Mr. Kharge was also referring to, saying, we are the rightful heirs of this country. We have fought for freedom. Everyone else who is in the political system is an outsider. And if you're coming into seats of power, you have just usurped our rightful place to rule this country. And so in such a case where everyone else who does not belong to one political dispensation or ideology is looked down upon or seen as outsiders, obviously if anybody who's revered by the other side has to be vilified. And Savarkar and many others, Savarkar is vilified, many others are forgotten. Contemporaries of Savarkar, the revolutionary movement, if you look at even the history of our freedom struggle, we've all been fed this, very, very linear, monochromatic narrative of how India won her freedom. But then if we just look for a change and then look at what were the other stories that were happening, was there an armed conflict that was also happening in this country right from 1857, the first war of independence, which in fact that phrase was coined by Savarkar. Till then it was, the British used to call it the Sepoy Mutiny in a very, to run it down. So from then to the 1946 naval mutiny, which was at the behest of INA and Subhash Chandra Bose, you've had an unending continuum of brave hearts who've carried out a Sashastra Kranti, armed struggle. And if you actually objectively look at it, every time the British yielded and brought in reforms, whether it was the 1909 Morley-Minto reforms, the 1918-19 the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, 1935 the Government of India Act, and of course 1947 when they left this country and went for good, all of that was preceded by a very large-scale, violent episodes of revolution. So there's that famous saying in Hindi, "Laaton ke bhoot baaton se nahi mante." So somewhere I think this the violence was a very integral part too of that freedom struggle. But then that has consciously been suppressed. That narrative has not been brought out into the public for obvious political reasons. And it's high time that we are looking at the subaltern voice, so to say, in our freedom struggle, and looking at what are all the alternative narratives that exist. And what is it that actually got India a freedom? That is completely a mystery even now to most people. Why did we get freedoms all of a sudden? Was it the World War? Was it the Quit India movement? If it was, that happened in 1942. So what were the British doing for 5 years? So was Quit India movement a failure? Was it the naval mutiny, as the British themselves acknowledged, as Clement Attlee had acknowledged when he came to India after independence, that it was the naval mutiny that made us leave this country? So what is it that got us freedom? Isn't that something so important for us as a free nation, as an independent country, to put our minds and thoughts together at? And we've just been in a collective national amnesia about it. And every time anyone questions that, one is called names and so on. And I think, it's been 7 decades. Now we can look at this part of our history in a very dispassionate and a very, let's not get emotional and sentimental about it. Let's analyze, dissect the roles, the contributions of all these heroes, Nehru, Gandhi, Patel, Ambedkar, Savarkar, Jinnah, whoever was it that was a part of this, the revolutionaries, and see what was the joint contribution of all these people to us getting freedom.
It's very interesting that you should talk about that we've always been fed a linear monochromatic narrative. It is true, because there are so many people in your book, not just Savarkar, but portraits of people like Bhikaji Kama, portraits of people like Madan Lal Dhingra, portraits of people like Shyamji Krishna Varma, which we have at the most studied in one line, just one line. Bhikaji Kama unfurled the Indian flag in Stuttgart. That's it. End of story. We don't know about her other contributions. About Madan Lal Dhingra, you have given as his full declaration in the court. And here was a young man who was in his early 20s saying to the British court that if you want to hang me, hang me. I don't recognize your court, because you have done far more greater damage to my country, and I feel that what I have done is a rightful thing. And this is something that our history books have completely blanked out. And we have been given only this one-sided version. So personally, I would like to thank you for putting things in perspective. And I agree with you that we need to look at our heroes dispassionately. And right now it's happening. But why is it that Savarkar draws such strong feelings. It's either ways, as you said, it's either completely hero worship or it is completely, oh, he didn't do anything. And I hate that word which people use without a callous disregard for what the man has done, that he was a stooge of the British. So I would like to come to the point that, and I know that a lot of times you get asked this, but let us look at it again. People keep saying that Savarkar wrote mercy petitions, quote unquote, to the British government. Is that true?
Okay, so that's like the elephant in the room that we probably have to address, and that I'm glad you brought that up. First of all, I wouldn't call these mercy petitions. I would call them petitions, just petitions. And if you look at the history of all the other political prisoners who were holed up at the cellular jail, the agency of submitting a petition was something that was normally provided to all prisoners, just as you could employ a lawyer to fight for your case. Now, if you in the book, in fact, I've put in the appendix all the petitions as is, right from the archives across various countries that I've got, and let people make whatever they want to make of it. Now, throughout from 1910 to 1920, during the First World War, before the war, after the war, the British actually instituted, in a formal way, this whole system of an amnesty. After the war, you had the royal amnesty that was given by Emperor George V to all political prisoners. So many of the political prisoners who were of the Congress party and who participated in the non-cooperation movement were all let off as a part of pardon from the government. So this whole clemency, seeking of amnesty, this was a very natural thing, one. The second thing was, Savarkar was a barrister. He was trained in law in London and a very meritorious lawyer at that. So he knew what were the loopholes of law. How do you use those, within the framework of the law, how do you use it to get out of jail? And his constant, theme to even the other fellow revolutionaries was, don't rot in jail. You can't achieve much by just sitting there and getting, rotting in the cellular jail. Get out and do something for the country. And that is where often it's also said, but Bhagat Singh never did, anything. He happily, embraced the noose. But then as a convict, it's not your call to choose what sort of punishment will be given to you. Bhagat Singh was given condemned to be hanged to death, but Savarkar was not condemned to be hanged to death. So what could he do? Could he tell the British, please hang me? He was given the longest punishment, the most harsh punishment that anybody in the freedom struggle history was given, of 2 life transportations, which amounted for 50 long years, 25 plus 25. He was a young man of 28 when he was arrested. If at all he survived and came out, he would have been 78. And by when he could do nothing either for his country or for his family as well. So what was to be achieved by living in that hellhole where no facilities were given, even the basic human facilities that were not provided to him? So in fact, even when the other revolutionaries, he writes about all of this very candidly, including about his petitions. He himself writes about it without any sense of shame or any sense of embarrassment, that I wrote this. I asked others also to write it. And all the other prisoners used to call him Bada Babu. He was almost like their leader, their spokesperson. So he was, English educated, he was a lawyer. Most of the others, largely from Bengal, the Alipur bomb case and so on, they were in their late teens, they had no education, they didn't know how to deal with the British legalese. So they would always approach him saying, "Hamare liye aap kuch kar dijiye, please do something for us." And in most of the petitions, if you see the 1913, 14, 17 petition, he always talks of it as a collective thing, saying, in the 1917 petition, for instance, he says, if my name constitutes an obstacle to the release of all the other political prisoners, then omit my name and release all the others, so that I will get as much happiness as my own release will do. Now that amply suggests that he was talking on behalf of everybody. The other interesting thing was in 1920, when his younger brother Narayan Rao actually approaches Mahatma Gandhi and says, both my brothers, Vinayak Damodar and his elder brother Ganesh Damodar, who is called Baba Rao, both of them were holed up at cellular jail. He said, both of them are rotting for so long. Can you please intervene and put a word to the British? It is Gandhiji who himself suggests, ask your brothers to file a petition. And I will then, after they file a petition, I will also file a petition on their behalf. And Gandhiji actually files a petition for them, saying, making a case for them. These were brave hearts, and they've probably gone into the wrong path, and they now want to come back into the constitutional, stream, which was facilitated by the British after the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. So Gandhi also, had a petition for them. So was Gandhi also a stooge then of the British? So we need to get this nuance very clearly. And also, as a lawyer, constantly, what he was asking for was, can you please clarify the status of a political prisoner? Now, in mainland India, if you were a political prisoner, you were eligible for certain concessions. You could get remission after some time. You could meet your family more often. You could write letters to them. All of that could be done. Whereas in Port Blair, the most inhuman conditions, the basic human dignity that was, compromised. They were given standing handcuffs for months together. Not even the basic facilities of good food. The food would often be rotten food mixed with reptiles and termites and snake pieces. And eating that, most of them would end up with diarrhea. Now, there were fixed times. Even the basic facility of using a toilet was not provided to these prisoners. And they had to go to the washroom only at fixed times. And if you're suffering from diarrhea and if you need to go more than once, you were not allowed. So most of these prisoners had to defecate in their own cells and live and sleep and eat and stand in that squalor. And they would contract skin diseases. They would contract so many other diseases. They had to wear these gunny sacks, clothes made of gunny sacks. So it would lead to rashes all over their body, leeches, attacking them. None of it getting treatment. And the punishment was so harsh. All day you were yoked to a oil grinding mill and had to go round and round in that blazing heat of Port Blair and extract oil, 30 pounds of oil every day. And if you fell short of that amount, you were flogged, you were not given enough food to eat. So this was the kind of tortures that these people in that distant hellhole face. So his petitions also say, clarify our position. These are the kind of tortures you give to a common convict of rape and murder and theft and all of that. We are all political prisoners, and all over the world, civilized governments treat political prisoners with some amount of dignity and respect. You're not doing that. And when we ask you, you say, but you are a petty criminal. But then petty criminals also get concessions after some time. And when we ask you, where are our concessions? You say, but you're a special class prisoner. So if we are a special class prisoner, give us that privilege. If we are a petty criminal, give us that privilege. Go by the law book. Go by what the jail rules say. And when you're not doing that, then what is our status? That's what he repeatedly says, clarify my position. And many other prisoners, including the famous revolutionary Sachindranath Sanyal, in his memoirs, Mera Bandi Jeevan, he writes very candidly that, I was advised by Savarkar and I wrote a petition very similar to what he did, but I was released and he was not. And he also explains the reason for that and says, the British government was so petrified of this man. He was classified as a D category or a dangerous criminal, and they wanted him out of both London as well as mainland India. And Sanyal says, letting him back into the Bombay presidency would rekindle the revolutionary zeal that had fizzled out. There was a lot of revolutionary movements. In Pune, you had the Chapekar brothers, you had Vasudev Balwant Phadke, a series of brave hearts who came from this city. So that would get rekindled if Savarkar and his brother were back. So at any cost, keep these people out, of mainland India. And in fact, Reginald Craddock, one of the Home Department members of the British government, comes to interview all these political prisoners. He interviews Savarkar, and in his own report that he filed to the government of India, and it's an official document, he says, I interviewed Savarkar, and he seems to have absolutely no sense of repentance or apology for whatever he did, the revolutionary activities that he did in London. So the British records talk about that. His petitions talk about that. The fellow, political prisoners talk about that. Yet we will not believe any of that, and we will go on calumnizing a man based on our presuppositions, preconceived ideas, only to suit our modern political, exigencies. And I think that is, if you want to play politics, it's perfectly fine. But then being ingenuous with historical truth and accuracy when facts are staring you in the face to the opposite, I think that needs to be very clear.
I would like to actually thank you for giving the text of the full petitions in your book, so that people who have this, misconceived notion, who are spreading this calumny, should actually buy this book and read the petitions word by word themselves. Don't trust his word. Read Savarkar's own petition. It's been reproduced here. You will get an answer of whether they were clemency petitions, whether they were petitions, or what they were. He was charged with waging and abetting the waging of war against the king, conspiring to wage war against the king, collecting arms with intent to wage war against the king, sedition and abetment of murder, IPC 302 and 109. These were the very stringent charges put against him. Now, Vikram talked about political prisoners, right? And he talked about the disparity between political prisoners in Andaman and in mainland India. So let me give a comparison here. Nehru was a political prisoner in India. He was arrested 9 times in his lifespan. He totally spent about 230 days in jail. His jail rooms, where he was given a proper bed with a mosquito net, he has a rose garden, he had a special dining room where meals would be served to him, he had a cook, he was allowed china plates, and he was given newspapers as well as paper to write his books. Savarkar spent 6 months in solitary confinement, 180 days, where he could not see anyone, where the only noise he could hear was people being dragged to the gallows. He spent 11 years in jail in Andamans and 13 years in jail in Ratnagiri. And he was also a political prisoner, mind you. It was not like he was some other kind of prisoner. And yet people are calling Savarkar a collaborator of the British. I mean, it's like there is no understanding of the facts, there is no understanding of the truth. But let us rewind again. These are severe charges that the British laid against Savarkar. So what did he do in his stay in London that merited such charges according to the British?
So Savarkar was someone who was so deeply influenced by the Italian revolutionaries. Usually when we think of revolution, we trace that to the ideology of Karl Marx. But here was a stream of thought in India which didn't trace its inspiration to Marx, but the Italian revolutionaries, Mazzini, Garibaldi, and the European secret societies that Thomas Frost writes about. And very similarly in India, he formed the first ever secret society, which was called the Rashtrabhakta Samuha, and later it became the Mitra Mela, and the name was rechristened to Abhinav Bharat. Now, even when he then received a scholarship by Shyamji Krishna Varma, that great colossus of Indian revolutionaries who had left India and established himself in London, and a lot of revolutionary activity in the 1910s happened in Europe, outside India, because the sedition laws that you mentioned were so stringent, perhaps as they are now too in India, that it was very difficult to do any anti-government activity against the British sitting in India. Whereas in Europe, it was so easy for the revolutionaries to publish newsletters or papers or whatever. So most of them, Bhikaji Kama, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, Shyamji Krishna Varma, all of them had settled there. Now on that scholarship, he goes to London and is admitted to the Gray's Inn in London to study, to be a barrister. But then he writes that my interest is not to study the law. I want to enter the enemy's camp, understand how things operate. I also, again inspired by the whole Mazzini idea, where Italy was under the Austrian Empire. They didn't have arms, so you had to smuggle arms, form these secret societies, give instruction of warfare across the country, and then create a simultaneous disaffection in the army and create an uprising. And that was the entire philosophy of the revolutionary movement, right from 1857 to 1946, as I mentioned. Now the edifice of this British Empire, you probably had a lakh or two, people from Britain who were, fair-skinned people who were here, who were ruling us. But the edifice actually stood on a lot of Indians who served in the army, in the bureaucracy, and all of that. So if that foundation was shaken, then the whole building would come crashing down. That was exactly what 1857 also attempted to do, create disaffection in the army. And finally, that is what was done in the naval mutiny, which is what got us freedom. So, so his idea too was that, go to London, study the art of making bombs, smuggle arms, Browning pistols, which you couldn't get in India. How do you get that? Get trained in how to shoot these pistols, bomb manuals. So it's a fascinating tale. It's almost like an Alfred Hitchcock novel, where there are these young brave hearts, all in their late teens, early 20s, who have come from middle-class families with stars in their eyes, who go to London to make a career for themselves, but they're so charged up by this zeal to free their motherland that they don't have any qualms about even giving their lives. And you have Senapati Bapat, again from this city, and Hemchandra Das Kanungo from Bengal. So there was also a lot of, in the days when there was no WhatsApp groups where you could exchange, or social media where you could, coordinate, these revolutionaries were actually talking to each other across India, Bengal and Maharashtra being two major centers, and Punjab also, saying how can we create a coordinated attempt to have an uprising all over India, and with the help of the army. So Senapati Bapat and Hemchandra Das from Maharashtra and Bengal are sent by Savarkar to go to Paris, learn about the art of making bombs. So they go there, and there they are sent, from there they are sent to Russia. They managed to get a manual, the bomb manual, and with that they then find that everything is in Russian. How do I understand this? So Hemchandra actually takes photographs, some 70 photographs. These are then ineligible to most of them. Then Senapati Bapat has a German girlfriend who is there in Berlin. So the revolutionaries were not all boring people. They also had their amount of fun with their European girlfriends and so on. So he goes there to Berlin, escaping customs all the time. There are Scotland Yard detectives who are always on the run, trying to find out what these dangerous young men are doing. And then finally this lady who takes 6 months to translate the bomb manual into English, and then it is translated to Marathi, Bengali, all Indian languages, and then smuggled back. Now, even that, it was so difficult, and so people had to put them in these false bottom boxes. So on the top, it would look like, Christmas presents, or Dawn Quickso papers, the Pickwick papers, all kinds of fancy names that were given to that. And below, you had these very, very dangerous items, including the bomb manual, sometimes the pistols themselves, the Browning pistols, all sent to India. These reached Tilak here in Pune. They went all the way to Bengal, to Aurobindo Ghosh, to Barin Ghosh, and that is what led to the Alipur and the Maniktola bomb case there. So while Savarkar's role, the British knew that one is his direct role in revolution, where he was the kingpin, so to say, trying to get all this out, bring these pistols, and those led to a lot of political assassinations. Anant Lakshman Kanhere, who assassinated the Nashik district magistrate AMT Jackson. Then of course in Bengal you had that. And the British managed to unravel this whole mystery, saying all these people are talking to each other somewhere. And the same manual, the same font, everything is there across Bengal, Maharashtra. What the hell is happening? And then they trace the whole trail back, and they say, oh, this is this puny little man he was a short statured man, not a very, tall and hefty person, muscular person. It is this man who is leading this whole thing. Alongside, and the irony is, somebody who is a revolutionary was also a very sensitive poet, who wrote some fantastic poetry in Marathi, probably milestones in Marathi literature. So they were equally, he probably never wielded a gun himself, but when we say the pen is mightier than the sword, and particularly in a literary festival, I think it was more germane in the case of Savarkar, where the British were more scared of the intellectual output that he produced. First, within 6 months of going to London, he had this entire biography of Mazzini translated into Marathi, and that was also smuggled back to India and published. And 2 years he spent in London archives researching about the 1857 uprising, which was called the Sepoy Mutiny. And he put for the first time an Indian perspective to this whole thing, saying what is the moving idea behind a revolution? What are the principles of a revolution? And these also came to India in 1909. Again, the first book in the history of world literature which was banned even before it was published. The British were so petrified of it. The Sea Customs Act was imposed on it, saying, you stop it at any cost. The Viceroy writes in a noting, this book should not enter India at any cost, because they knew the dangerous seditious content that it had and its ability to inspire young men to take up arms and fight them out. So this book, in fact, despite all the restrictions that were put by the government, it manages to come to India. There also, it comes to his Baba Rao, his elder brother. He's unable to find a publisher. Then the manuscript is sent back to London. From there, they send it to Paris. The police is behind them. Then the manuscript goes from there to Germany. They think the Devanagari script there, being an Indology center, somebody would be able to do it. But then someone messes up with the Marathi script there. So that is junked. From there it is sent to Belgium, Holland. Finally, somewhere there it is published, and the book then makes its way to India. And that book, mind you, for 3 decades after it was published, it was like a veritable Bible for revolutionary movement in India. Bhagat Singh is supposed to have been inspired so much by that he got the second edition of that book published. It was Bhagat Singh who published this, and anybody, I've mentioned it in the book, young people who wanted to get into the HSRA, the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, in their interviews they were asked, have you read the 1857 book by Savarkar? Have you read The Life of Barrister Savarkar, his biography? So this became like the entry criteria, so to say, to be a revolutionary. 2 decades later, you had INA raids, the Indian National Army. Copies of the book translated into Tamil and so on were found in raids in Madras. Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and Rash Bihari Bose got the book translated into Japanese when they were in Tokyo. So the intellectual corpus, for the first time, giving this whole revolution a sort of strategy, a sort of intellect was something that Savarkar did, and that was more dangerous than actually going and bumping someone off. And constantly, what we are taught, in our history and in our films and popular media is these revolutionaries were all these hot-blooded young men, misguided. They just picked up the gun, tesh mein aa gaye, they just went and killed someone, and then happily, brave hearts, they sang their way and went and embraced death. But that was not what it was. There was a lot of strategy, there was a lot of intellect, lot of planning that went into it. And this man was at the heart of this entire planning. And that is precisely the reason why the British feared him and called him a D category or dangerous category criminal. And he had to be kept away from the influence of all other Indians, far, far away in cellular jail where he could rot and die for anyone could care any less.
So he was saying that he was a nucleus of not just Indian, but of global revolutionary activity. It's interesting to say you say that because this didn't stop in 1947. I come from Goa, and my father was a revolutionary. He was part of an outfit called Azad Gomantak Dal, which was modeled after Azad Hind Sena. So he once told me that he was inspired by Bhagat Singh and Netaji, but they were inspired by Savarkar. So Savarkar is the Gangotri. That's the word my father used. He was a Gangotri of all revolutionary thought. And you have said in your book that he was the fountainhead of all revolutionary activities. It's fascinating, actually. Now we move to Savarkar when he moved from... I'll come to the poet part. It's very fascinating. You've used in your book, you've said that he's a man with a poet's heart and a revolutionary's brain, right? It's a very potent combination, actually. And if you see that at the most challenging moments in his life, he has always taken solace in poetry. Whether he jumped at Marsai and he was recaptured, or whether when Madanlal Dhingra died, then he wrote Sagara Pranatala Marla. When he was caught back, he wrote Anadimi, Anantami, Avadhyami. And even when his son died, he wrote a poem to his son saying that Prabhakaras. So how would a man with so much of a sensitivity, of a poetical bent, would have this, completely different side of it? Or are they two sides of the same coin?
I think it's two sides of the same coin, and I mentioned that repeatedly that, for me, Savarkar is a very fascinating character, stripping all these political ideologies, these meaningless political debates on either side, right, left, center, whatever be it. Just the fascination, a man of contradictions. I think he's a historian's enigma, and that is what fascinates me. These monochromatic lives, very linear, so boring. You need to have shades, and this man has so many multiple shades. A great poet, as you said, a fiery orator who could move anybody, and people say we used to almost get hallucinated and hypnotized, when we heard what he said, and he could lure them into, his viewpoint. A very great playwright who wrote so many plays in Marathi on social issues, on revolution, on freedom, and all of that. And somebody who was an atheist, who was anti-ritual. Normally you would associate somebody who propounded a theory like Hindutva, which today is probably called divisive and bigoted and all of that, to be this very orthodox person, born in a Chitpavan Brahmin community, very, very orthodox, traditional, but he was completely an antithesis of that. So much so that he earned the ire of most of the, traditional orthodox upper caste Brahmins in Ratnagiri and other parts of Maharashtra for his path-breaking social reforms that he undertook. So a man of so many multiple shades, I don't know how he managed to balance this Jekyll and Hyde within him. And that's what probably makes him fascinating for a person, a biographer, a historian, to see how does one negotiate these completely contradictory strands. As you said, someone who can take a gun and or inspire someone to take a gun and kill somebody is also having the sensitivity to write poetry. And very rightly, I mean, at every low point of his life, he lost his mother at a very, very young age. And probably that germinated poetry in him, if my assessment is anything to go by. And his father also he lost when he was hardly 12, 13 years old. So losing one's parents at such a young age, and then even in the cellular jail when I mentioned all those tortures, imagine the person's mental state where someone would collapse. There were other political prisoners who would actually commit suicide. Many would go mad. There was an entire mental asylum that was started at the Haddo Island in Andamans only for the political prisoners, because so many of them would just go insane because of the kind of tortures. They couldn't face it. Young men who would break, their spirits would break. But here was a man, since he was denied a pen and paper to write, with his fingernails, he would actually etch poems on the walls of his cell. 6,000 verses, not something any paltry sum. 6,000 verses of poem. Kamala, Saptarshi, these are all have become milestones again in Marathi literature. And just to spite him, you had this cruel jailer, David Barry, and in front of his eyes, this whole thing would be whitewashed. But little did he know that this man he was dealing with had an elephantine memory. The entire, all these verses he would commit to memory, and after his release, these were published. And we still, thankfully, have these poems with us as heirloom. So I think it is these shades of a historical character which we need to look at, rather than get into this nonsensical, political debate of BJP versus Congress and left parties and all of this. That can go on its own. But for sensible people, for historians, for academics, for people like all of us, all of you who probably may not have anything to do directly with politics, I think it's important to see characters of the past with this prism of what all have they undergone, what is their life journey, and what inspiration can we draw from that.
Another thing that impressed me about Savarkar, after reading your book especially, is that he was always a man of action. So when he was incarcerated in Andaman for 11 long years, anybody else would have either felt sorry for themselves, gone insane, or just cursed the British government or whatever, or the fate or God or whoever. He didn't believe in God, but besides the point. But he actually used that time to get other prisoners together and start a movement for prison reforms, even in such adverse circumstances. So because of him, there was a library established. Because of him, food got better. Because of him, they stopped conversions. So do you think his turnaround or his metamorphosis as a Hindutva ideologue, as somebody who has propounded this political doctrine of Hindutva, started in Andamans, or was it before that?
I think that's also a very, very important question. The life in the jail transformed him completely. We often accuse him of being a bigoted person, a divisive figure, an anti-Muslim, almost an Indian version of Nazi Hitler and all of this. But then even this whole concept of Hindutva, I think it deserves a little bit of exposition as to what was the context, the reason for its birth. Now, around 1919, you had this whole agitation of the Khilafat movement, which Mahatma Gandhi launched. And contrary to what we are taught, it was not, it was a Khilafat that was launched first, and the non-cooperation movement was yoked to it much later, much against the wishes of most of the Congress people. C.R. Das, Annie Besant, all of them were quite opposed to this movement. Now, what exactly was this Khilafat movement? After the First World War, you had Turkey, which had lost to Britain and her allies. And Turkey was ruled by this caliph, who was held in regard by a small section of Muslims, particularly the Sunni Muslims. And the saddest part was people in Turkey were fed up of their sultan and they wanted him out. And so you had Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who took over later as the new democratic this thing in Turkey. But then Gandhi, in his vision, I think the road to hell is always paved with noble intentions. So, but ultimately that was a road to hell for the Indian polity, where you're mobilizing an entire community on communal lines. And if I personally find it a very, very pernicious and a dangerous move that was done. It was literally playing with fire. And several people have mentioned that in the book, including Pandit Nehru, says we were aghast at what we saw because, on stages, on public platforms, you had people like Muhammad Ali, Shaukat Ali, who were part of this Khilafat agitation, making open calls to jihad against kafirs. Now, and when many people like Swami Shraddhanand whispers to Gandhi's ears saying, this is very dangerous, this can lead to social unrest, Gandhi smiles and says, no, no, this is not against us. So all the time it was like the whole idea to bring the Muslim community into the freedom struggle. He thought this was the best way to do it without thinking too much about the consequences. So what did he promise people? He promised the community that if you join this movement, then within 1 year, I will get you I'll get the re-establishment of Khilafat in Turkey, sitting in India. And in 1 year, we will get Swaraj for all of us. So it was like a monkey balancing for both the Congress, this one, as well as the Muslim leaders. Now, naturally, the British were not obliged to one band of people raising flags here and there in a colony like India, saying you have won the war there, but we want our choice of ruler to be established there. It belies all logic. Why would the British actually accede to such a demand? But then they were mobilized so much and they were given so much of hope that within 1 year this will be achieved. That this was really, and these were all, not all of them were, well-intentioned. Many of them were communally surcharged. They were fanatical. And so if you see right from 1920s, the whole 1920s was surcharged with communal riots and clashes across India. You had the Mopla carnage in Malabar. You had riots rocking almost every place in India because there had to be a backlash somewhere. This happened during the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, where if you mobilize people on a communal issue, even the people who mobilize it are then unable to control the mob. The mob just goes out of control, and even Advani then calls it the saddest day of his life. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but then this is playing with fire, and when you do that, you have to be responsible and held to account for the consequences. So Gulbarga, Kohat, Panipat, Delhi, Calcutta, Bengal, the whole country was rocked with communal clashes. And when thousands and thousands of Nayars in Kerala were massacred, women raped, it was a genocide, babies were killed by fanatic mobs. Gandhi's response to all of that was the Moplas are brave men who are fighting for the cause of their religion. And a few years later, when Swami Shraddhanand of the Arya Samaj is murdered by a fanatic, Abdul Rashid, he actually says, my dear brother Abdul Rashid, I don't consider this as a crime. We need to consider the psyche of the assassin and what goes behind his mind. Of course, those following him didn't follow the same principle when 20 years later, Godse did a very heinous crime of murdering the same man who actually did this, a very, very heinous crime at it. And you had Maharashtrian Brahmins also being massacred in different parts of Maharashtra.
That is a history nobody wants to talk about. That's a history
no one wants to talk about. So there needed to be someone who also gave an intellectual response to this very, very difficult and dangerous period that the country was going to. And a lot of the Hindu community was just going behind a Pied Piper without thinking whether they're being led to doom or whether it's actually leading to something. And so Savarkar took it upon himself to write this whole treatise it's a slim book compared to most of his other books, called Essentials of Hindutva. And what is important is he wrote this book in English. All across, he wrote in Marathi, and a prolific writer in Marathi. Why was this book written in English? It was obvious that it was being written for a pan-Indian audience. And he was trying to send a message not just to his Maharashtrian readers, but to people all over the country. So with that in mind, he gives this formula in the context of those extraterritorial allegiances that people were being forced to have. You're sitting here, but then why do you really need to bother about the Turkey Sultan? It should not be your concern. Your concern should first be gaining independence for your country. That is what affects your life, your livelihood, your family's livelihood, all of that. So this formula of Sindhu, Sindhu Paryanta, right from the Indus to the seas, this landmass, anybody who considers this as their Pitru Bhumi and Punya Bhumi, and there also, Pitru Bhumi, people say, oh, it's fatherland, so this is like Nazi version and all of that. But Pitru is not father, it's actually our ancestors. We are in the Pitru Paksh right now. That doesn't make it only our fathers or the male ancestors, it's all our Pitrus. So anybody who has their ancestors in this part of the country and who consider this land as their holy land, Punya Bhumi. And there too it is not about religion, Papa Punya in the religious context, but anyone who has reverence and devotion for this country and owes the first loyalty and allegiance to this place rather than something thousands of miles away and thinks about that all the time over this, they could be considered as Hindus. And in that he mentions right at the preface that I have nothing to do with the theological religion of Hinduism. My Hindutva is not based or related to Hinduism. It's more of a cultural identity, a nationalistic marker, and it's a big rubric, an umbrella within which everybody can actually live together, including Muslims, Christians, Jains, Parsis, Buddhists, Sikhs, whoever. And he also, asks this question like Annie Besant or Sister Nivedita, who were from outside, but Sister Nivedita converted, but then Annie Besant did not. But what do you do with them? How do you categorize them? He says they have probably done more for this country than native Indians, so they would also be Hindus according to my definition. So this had nothing to do with the religious aspect or the theological aspect of the religion. But, and also interestingly, when you mentioned the Masai case, when he jumps ship and this case goes to the International Court of Justice in Hague, just as we are having the Kulbhushan Jadhav thing between India and Pakistan. So at that time too, Savarkar had a Parsi, lawyer called Baptista. But in all the French records, if you see, he is referred to as a Hindu lawyer, Hindou. So for the rest of the world, the synonymity between Indian and Hindu was quite established. So he just tried to give it a sense of structure. And the inclusivity in it, he says, whether it's a Brahmin, it's a Nair, it's a tribal in some Andaman, jungle, it's a Jain, it's a Jangama, it's somebody else, Sikh, Bauddha, anybody, we all have the same blood. And we all have our ancestors who come from here. They didn't come from somewhere else. Of course, someone came there, there were conversions, there were intermarriages, but our original ancestors, our DNA belongs to this place. So in such a case, intercaste marriage, intercaste dining, all of this should be so natural because all of us are the same. So how does this become a divisive thing or a bigoted thing when all you say is everybody is the same, everybody is one? Of course, there has to be some criteria of if you have a passport, you have to have some allegiance to your country. So that's sort of a cultural passport, so to say, where you say, if I owe my allegiance to this country primarily, then I become a Hindu, which is another euphemism for saying I'm an Indian, Bharatiyata. And I think with the Supreme Court also ruling much later that Hindutva is a way of life and not as a religious identity, I think that somewhere also justifies what Savarkar propounded initially with this treatise.
Which brings me to the question between Gandhi and Savarkar. A lot of times Savarkar gets judged on certain things, but Gandhi has done probably the same things in a much more grander way, but he does not get judged. For example, when Savarkar said join the British Army, he said it for a different purpose, right? And Subhash Chandra Bose later agreed also that these people were trained by the British and then later on they deserted the British Army and then they joined the INA. But people judge him by saying that, oh, he asked people to join the British Army, so he was a collaborator of the British, right? But Gandhi, during the Anglo-Boer War, he actually went from village to village in Gujarat, recruiting, First World War, recruiting, Anglo-Boer War it was, no? Okay, First World War, recruiting people to join the British Army, and he actually was commended by the British for it.
He even got a gold medal for loyalty to the British government for his support to the Boer War, to the First World War and all of that.
So why is the same yardstick not applied to Gandhi? That is applied to Savarkar by the same people, which also reminds me, the people who these days are begging the CBI court saying that, oh, our man needs a pillow, our man needs a commode, our man needs a chair in his custody, these are the same people who are actually spreading the canard that Savarkar did so-called mercy petition. These guys cannot stay in CBI custody, which has a separate toilet. They still want a pillow from home. I mean, this is completely ridiculous. But anyway, besides the point. So, So I want to come back to this thing about Gandhi and Savarkar. In many ways, they were two poles apart, around which the Indian political thought and political system sort of revolved. And while Gandhi has always been deified and he's been made into this icon, do you feel that in today's India, it is actually Savarkar's thoughts that are being implemented, but Gandhi is still the icon?
You're going to land me in trouble.
That's the whole point, Vikram.
That's the whole point? Okay, I didn't know that. I thought you were a friend. But that's an interesting question because, and I've said this often to much controversy and hatred, but these two men are fascinating for me as a historian to look, they are not just poles, they are irreconcilable poles. And I think the way their portraits hang in the Central Hall of Parliament, they're diagonally opposite to each other, quite symbolically. The twain shall never meet in this case because everything they said and stood for were opposites of each other. Fascinating anecdotes that I also came across of how these two young men first met. So Savarkar was a young man in the India House and Gandhi comes calling from South Africa and he sees Savarkar cooking something in the kitchen and he wants to engage him in discussion and Savarkar says, first let's eat and then talk. And then he says, what is being cooked? He's horrified to see this Chitpavan Brahmin cooking prawns. And Gandhi, being a staunch vegetarian, says, oh, no, I cannot partake of this meal. And then Savarkar then chides him and says, if you cannot eat with us, how will you fight with us? And these are just boiled fish. Now, we want young men who are trained to eat the British alive. So, so how can you be so pacifist? So obviously it was not the best of first meetings of two people, and the chasm between the two continuously kept widening all through their lives. They met 2 or 3 times, and each time was an episode in itself. In the second meeting in London, during the Dashera, Gandhi talks about, he says, I don't want to talk politics, I will talk about the greatness of Ram Rajya. And he extols very nicely about it. And much to his disdain, I think, or discomfort, after him, you have Savarkar, a fiery orator. And somewhere, I think Gandhi was also a little insecure about this man who was much, fiery speaker. He says, we had a very nice discourse on Ram Rajya, but then even to establish Ram Rajya, Rama had to kill Ravana. You had to have violence. You didn't sit in a fast in front of Ravana and then he said, okay, take Sita and go back. So, and this is the time of Dashera, the 9 days of Devi, of Durga, and on each day she is adorned with a new weapon, right? What does that really symbolize? That symbolizes courage, that symbolizes violence. And violence, not for the heck of violence, but then for good over evil. That's been our fundamental thing of Indian society, that good always vanquishes evil. And to do that, that's one reason why all our gods are shown with all their weapons, not bloodthirsty iconography, but to symbolize this. So throughout there was this disconnect. Much later, Gandhi, if you also look at some of his views on, say, caste and so on, it baffles me because he says, I don't find anything odious in the caste system. I believe in the Varnashram system. That is fundamental to Hindu society. If Varnashram system is taken, Hinduism will be dislodged. And so he says, everybody cannot become a prime minister or a viceroy. Things have to be hereditary. So that goes against the very grain of democracy, right? Everybody can become the prime minister. It need not be the preserve of only one family or one party or anybody. Anybody can become a prime minister in a democracy. So in that context, when you see Ambedkar and Savarkar, their views on all of this is so similar on caste, on a complete dismantling of the caste system. He says, Savarkar talks about, there's nothing Sanatan about the caste system. If it was, and he says in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is supposed to have said, all the 4 Varnas are made by me. And if this is infallible, how come we have a 5th Varna of untouchables? That was not one of the 4 Varnas. So if this was the 5th Varna which would come out of the 4th Varna, how is it that it is infallible? And also among the Brahmins, you have so many subsects. One doesn't eat with the other, one doesn't marry into the other caste. So the very fact that these things have mutated over ages shows that these are not infallible. So when something that is not infallible, it is not Sanatan, it is not eternal. So let's do away with something that is detrimental to the unity of our society. Now, to your other question about the vision of India, I always say it's probably Gandhi's, it's probably Savarkar's vision. And again, to much peril, I'm sticking my neck out and saying this, that if you look at it, nobody may acknowledge this, but it is Savarkar's vision of India that somewhere fructified. and I'll explain how. On independence, we were told Gandhi was of the view that the army needs to be dismantled. Now there's no need for one. We are a peaceful, loving, non-violent nation, so we don't need one. At the same time, when marauders and hordes of tribes were attacking our western frontiers from Pakistan, luckily that was not done. And over the decades, and particularly after nuclear, the tests and the militarization, we are one of the biggest armies in the world, and thankfully so, considering the dangerous neighborhood that we are placed in. So we are a very strong militarized nation today, and that was somewhere his vision. His vision, even on aligning with Israel and being natural allies with the Jews, the parallels between Zionism and herds, and him and Hindutva, and he talking about a nation for the Jews there. It has taken us so many years to actually befriend a country which is actually a friend and ally of India. And so in foreign policy, in military policy, what about economic policy? I mean, Gandhi's idea of the Charkha, Gram Swaraj, rural economy, India lives in the villages. In the face of the free market capitalist economy that Savarkar espoused, and which is what has come to fructification after especially the liberalization of 1991 and the way we have gone thereafter, and rapid urbanization that we see in this country, that's again that vision that has prevailed. On the need for a casteless society, and the fact that anybody can aspire for the top job in this country, and the fact that today even incidents, single incidents like say the abrogation of Article 370 in Kashmir, and how right in the cellular jail, his mantra to all the other prisoners is one God, one country, one language, one race, one caste. And many people hold this against him, saying, was he espousing a unitariness? Now, the Indian right, whatever you may accuse them of, I think this has been a constant belief for them, right from, I think, Savarkar to Shyama Prasad Mukherjee to Atal Bihari Vajpayee to now Modi and Amit Shah, that this unitariness is not about unitariness culturally. Culturally you can be diverse, but constitutionally and legally and politically you need to be one nation. So you can't have a nation within a nation, is what Savarkar also repeatedly talks about. So this separate constitution for one part of the country, and that had to be done away. So that also becomes his vision somewhere. And then this whole triple talaq and its scrapping, a gender discriminatory law. In his Hindu Mahasabha presidential speeches, he always says, no Hindu should get an extra privilege only because he or she is a Hindu and is a majority. And by likewise terms, no minority community needs to get a privilege only on the virtue of being a minority community. Everyone needs to be equal before the eyes of the law. There has to be no discrimination on the basis of race, religion, caste, gender among Indians. So a very gender discriminatory practice like the triple talaq being done away with, I think is a welcome move, and somewhere that is also an espousal of the same sort of principle. So while, it's given the complexity around him, the polarizing views that people have against him, even his, acolytes or even the BJP or Mr. Modi, of course, goes to the cellular jail and pays his obeisances, but then many people in the BJP may not even, he's the orphan that nobody wants to, adopt. But then Gandhi is that father of the nation whom everyone wants to be under that umbrella. So even the BJP will always use him as a symbol. In Swachh Bharat, his spectacles, that is the logo. Modi will go to different countries and gift books on Gandhi to them. So this is politics, and I don't want to get into real politics and its necessity. But then one becomes the father of the nation, and the other is the antithesis of the father of the nation, who will always be a pariah, who will perhaps always be unaccepted, even though his views and philosophies will be accepted. And in his lifetime too, he writes in his memoirs very candidly, and those who know Marathi should read the original also, where he says, in my lifetime, nobody will probably accept me, you'll be ridiculing me, but after I'm dead and gone, several decades later, you will all come round to my viewpoint that what I had said was true. So, this it's far-fetched, but then, he always romanticized and fantasized the idea of dying a martyr. But there too, I think Gandhi stole a march over him, and he was just in terms of the rivalry, not the heinous bit of it, but it was Gandhi who became the martyr, and Savarkar, implicated in the assassination of the same man, just on flimsy evidence which was later acquitted of by the court because one of his acolytes was Godse, who conducted this very bad, terrible crime. So one becomes a martyr, is elevated to the status of father of the nation. The other, who always wanted to die a martyr for the country, is condemned and put into the dustbin of history, so to say, never to be resurrected, never to be acknowledged, never to be given the respect that he deserves or his contributions acknowledged for political reasons, even by those who claim allegiance to him. So that somewhere becomes the tragedy of this man, where it's almost like a Greek tragedy, where someone who's done so much, his family has sacrificed so much for this country, he has sacrificed so much, but then taking his name or acknowledging it becomes a big trouble. I have been called so many names of being a Sanghi and right-wing and this and that and the rest. It doesn't really matter to me. But anyone who's even associated remotely with this man becomes the target of a lot of hatred and insinuation. And probably that's, with time it will go. I think sunlight is the best disinfectant, as they say. So maybe more sunlight is put into all the archival documents which no one has accessed. Maybe public perceptions will change. As they say, a public hai, sab janti hai.
Thank you so much actually for writing this book and taking the first step towards objective reassessment of Savarkar and what its thoughts were. His books are available outside, I think, so I would request everybody, whether you like Savarkar or don't, go through this book and maybe you will change your views.